Hello and welcome, friends. I hope everybody's having a great day so far. If you are new here, welcome. And if you're back, welcome back. I greatly appreciate all of the ongoing support. This is my channel, Dragonsjewel Creative Gems, and I'm Tegan, and I'm just going to get all that wonderful YouTubey stuff out of the way first. If you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, please consider doing so. It's just down below there. And of course, any love, comments, suggestions, all those wonderful things, there's that comment section down there. And don't forget to hit that like button as well. Today we are going to be doing our Ghostly Echoes series, and we had been going through the province of Alberta. I've now finished up Alberta and we are moving west to British Columbia, also known as BC. So those will be the next series of ghost stories that we'll be covering starting this episode. We'll see how far we get with those, and I hope you guys enjoy these next few spooky tales. This story takes place in Coquitlam, British Columbia. Sidewalk Spectres. Sometimes it can be difficult to figure out why a particular location is haunted. At other times, the reasons are very easy to understand. For example, in the following story from Coquitlam, which is just a short distance east of Vancouver, it seems that in the summer of 1985, the owner of a small apartment house decided to fix the place up a bit. As part of his renovations, he purchased 130 stone slabs to use as a decorative pathway. What none of the tenants in the building knew at the time was that their pretty new sidewalk had been constructed from headstones. Headstones removed when the land previously used by nearby Woodlands Hospital Cemetery was turned into a park. The hauntings in the building began as soon as the new pathway was laid. For the most part, the displaced spirits were benign. They were, however, impossible to ignore as they wandered throughout the various suites in the apartment block. One occupant was concerned enough to bring in a psychic who confirmed that there were many spirits about the place, but reported that most of them were quite harmless beyond their occasionally annoying ghost-like practical jokes, such as causing electrical devices to malfunction. The people whose homes were in this particular building had more than their share of those sorts of problems. Toasters would spontaneously heat up, lights would turn on and off, televisions would change channels, all when no one was near them. Considerably more disturbing, however, were the ghost sightings. A woman whose name has only been recorded as Miss Schneider reported catching an occasional glimpse of the apparition of a child. In a nearby suite, however, the ghostly sightings were decidedly more threatening. There, children saw disembodied faces at night, and as they stared in horror, their beds would shake violently. The building began to develop a well-deserved reputation as a haunted apartment house. Children from the neighborhood became fascinated with the place, while one pried up and turned over a piece of newly installed sidewalk. The youngsters fled as soon as they discovered that the particular piece of the walk had been upturned was a headstone from a child's grave. When the tenants expressed their displeasure at their landlord's decidedly odd sense of decorum, he relented, dug up the walk, and created a more traditional one. Unfortunately, the haunting had already become well established, and phantoms were seen in the buildings for many years afterward. By the early 1990s, the energy of the understandably agitated spirits had sufficiently subsided so that the dead and the living were at least able to share their accommodation in peace. This story takes place in Waldo, British Columbia. Where's Waldo? In the case of the British Columbia town of that name, the answer to that question is that what's left of it has been flooded over. However, according to local historian John Kinnear, some of Waldo does reappear at certain times of the year. Located southwest of Fernie, Waldo was once a thriving community with 2 large sawmills, 2 hotels, a large school, stores, an Anglican church, and a post office serving a population of 700 people. The town's decline began in the early 1920s when the first mill closed. Less than 3 years ago, a fire destroyed virtually the entire town, leaving only 6 houses and the church standing. In 1972, the church was moved to nearby Baines Lake. The remnants of the houses were demolished to the footings, and the entire area was flooded as a consequence of the construction of the Libby Dam and the subsequent filling of Lake Kokonessa. It is the foundations of those last remaining residents that appear when the lake's water level dips. All the houses were vacant long before they were destroyed, with the possible exception of a haunted house that may still have sheltered its ghost. Like the town itself, a haunted house in Waldo was small, so small that it could have been a cozy and welcoming little place, but it was not. The place should have been a bargain, considering the small amount of rent that a landlord could demand in the isolation of a ghost town, but in terms of wear and tear on the tenants' nerves, one of Waldo's last occupied houses was anything but a good deal. By the time a painter and his wife signed a short-term lease for the place, the paranormal activity in it had already driven out at least one tenant. To help ensure that these new residents would at least have a chance of staying the season that they had planned to, the landlord tried to explain as clearly as possible that unique rental conditions were attached to the property. He even went so far as to set down some decidedly particular guidelines, not recommended by any landlord and tenant act that I've ever heard of. The couple was advised to always leave everything in the house just as they found it, no matter how inconvenient they might find it to be. Windows, for instance, that they found open should be left that way, even if doing so meant that the interior became uncomfortably chilly. These unusual terms, combined with a definite feeling of an unease while in one of the bedrooms, caused the new occupants to make inquiries of old-timers in the area. Before long, the couple had pieced together the reasons, not only for the former tenant's flight, but also for their own feelings of discomfort and for their landlord's strange directions. It seemed that the little house was widely believed to be haunted by a ghost of an elderly man who had once called the place home. As they were intending to stay only for the summer, the couple decided to make the best of their strange housing bargain. In order to accommodate the never-seen but frequently felt presence, they were careful to abide by their landlord's advice. They left the furniture arranged exactly as it was when they first saw the place, even though the arrangement was not the one they would have preferred. They never opened a window that they found closed, nor closed one that was open. The ghost, however, did not return their courtesies. It would frequently scatter books and papers about the place. Regardless of the mess, the couple always left everything as they found it. They learnt from experience that eventually the unseen hands that had caused the disorder would tidy the mess that they had made. Despite the couple's efforts to be considerate, they were living in a haunted house, and the ghost was apparently not letting them forget it. Every evening, for instance, the clock on the mantel would chime. This situation in itself might not have been considered too unusual, except that the clock was only a shell, with no internal mechanism. The clock should have been incapable of making any sound. Furthermore, doors would suddenly slam closed with such force that all the window panes in the house would shake. A few months later, as planned, the couple moved out of town, having lost little except temporarily their serenity. In return, they had gained a unique experience and a stockpile of stories with which to entertain their friends and families for years to come. Knowing about the dam construction and its associated flooding, we do know that the answer to the popular question, "Where's Waldo?" but we're still left to ponder where the ghost of Waldo could have gone. This story takes place in North Vancouver, British Columbia. Jason and Johnny. For the time during the 1970s, on a quiet street in North Vancouver, a most unusual friendship flourished. Unfortunately, this friendship had a lot of people concerned. You see, there was quite a difference in the ages of the two parties involved. Jason was just a little boy, and Johnny was an adult. More importantly, Johnny was dead. Had been for years. But Jason was a lonely little fellow who wasn't in a position to be too picky about how and where he chose his friends. He was an only child of a single mother. Johnny came to see Jason regularly and was nice to the boy. Those qualifications were more than adequate for friendship as far as Jason was concerned. The situation, however, was of grave concern to Jason's mother. Her son's relationship with Johnny had begun when the child was less than a year old. She first became aware that something extremely unusual was happening when she awoke to a strange sound coming from Jason's bedroom. At first she wasn't able to identify the sound, but after listening for a few seconds, she realized that the little boy was laughing out loud and hard. The woman flew from her room into Jason's, presuming that the child was just dreaming. What she found gave her quite a start. Her son was sitting up in his crib and laughing hysterically. It was clear to Jason that there was someone else in the room with him, and that someone was bringing him no end of delight. Unfortunately, his mother could not see what her son could. The laughing incident was only the beginning. These strange nightly occurrences became longer and more frequent. As a result, the child was missing out on badly needed sleep. He was completely exhausted, she said of her son during that period. One morning, after the visits had been going on for more than a year, Jason's mother discovered that the child's room had been trashed. Bedding had been ripped, toys smashed, and the legs of his bed had been torn off, the mother recalled. All of this destruction after a night when their house had been unusually quiet. Much to her almost immediately regret, she punished Jason for having done so much damage to his room. She realized not long afterward that Jason could not possibly have been responsible for the mess. He was neither big enough nor strong enough to have wrought that much destruction. In retrospect, she realized that it was Johnny, not Jason, who had ravaged the room. And Johnny's antics were about to increase in frequency and intensity. Over the next few years, mother and son lived in chaos. Because he was visiting with his friends, Jason rarely slept between the hours of midnight and 4 in the morning. Jason's mother once watched in horror as a lampshade spun madly on its frame. No one was near the fixture at the time. The kitchen in the house became a focal point for ghostly activity. Cupboard doors flew open and closed. Doors that were open would slam shut. A small appliance that had been hung on a wall dropped to the floor. In the living room, an ornament that had been standing on a table flew toward a couch. A friend from the neighborhood who was visiting watched as Jason's mother emptied dirty water from a vase of flowers. Seconds later, she returned to the kitchen table to join her friend and found the vase once again filled with dirty water. The mother's doctor thought that the woman had suffered a nervous breakdown when he heard her describe her living conditions. Fortunately, there had been witnesses to these other occurrences as well, and so her friends and family were able to vouch for her sanity. In addition to the water from the flowers reappearing, friends of Jason's mother had seen a hanging lamp swinging madly and pictures rocking back and forth, as well as the lampshade spinning. When a friend's daughter heard a disembodied growl, Jason's mother knew that she couldn't cope any longer. Her discomfort increased considerably when she began to hear talk around the neighborhood that her home stood on ground that had once been a burial site for Barad's First Nations band. Feeling at a loss as to how to cope with the situation that she had found herself in, the woman contacted both a member of the Vancouver Psychic Society and a person from the Barad band. The pair was able to confirm the woman's suspicions. Jason, they told her, was definitely being visited by the spirit of a band member whose body had, years ago, been interred somewhere very near the house. They were not, however, able to effect anything that would put a stop to the hauntings. In the meantime, the strength of the visitor from beyond increased to the point that she could hear the ghost's deep masculine voice. Jason, however, remained the only person who could actually see his friend. The lad described the entity as looking like Daniel Boone in buckskins. Eventually, the haunting escalated, and the woman contacted a psychologist to ask for help. In the doctor's opinion, the boy had been traumatized by his father's departure from the family and had created Johnny from anthropomorphized psychic energy. It is doubtful that the psychologist's diagnosis brought Jason's mother much consolation. Whether the spirit had manifested from the native burial ground or from her son's mental powers, it undeniably did exist. Not only had she heard a grown man's voice when she and Jason were alone in the house, but she and others had witnessed the mysterious whirlwinds of energy that had an unseen force had blown through her house on numerous occasions. This story is one of the many ghost stories that, for us, can have no definitive ending. There is apparently no information available about what happened with this paranormally disturbed family since the summer of 1976, when Jason was a child of 3. In many cases like this one, children temporarily lose their ability to perceive the supernatural and do not regain it until they reach puberty. If Jason followed this pattern, life for mother and son would have calmed down for a time. All that we can do is hope that Jason not only survived his childhood, but perhaps even thrived because of its unusual nature. This story takes place in South Central British Columbia, halfway between Trail and Grand Forks. The Phantom Woodcutter's Ball. Legend has it that along Highway 3 in South Central British Columbia, almost exactly halfway between Trail and Grand Forks, there is a haunted, abandoned mountainside home. The place is so haunted that few people have managed to spend an entire night there, not even on a dare. The ghosts that haunt the spooky old place are not only an industrious lot, but appear to disapprove of unhealthy habits, such as smoking cigarettes, although their apparent disapproval might just be another way of annoying any of the living who venture into their domain. Neither the history of the old two-story place nor the identities of the ghosts are known. Judging from their activities, it's probably safe to assume that they were woodcutters in the nearby mountain forests. One man, recorded only as Mr. JPL, came on a bet that he'd made with a friend. Confident that he would win both the bet and the increased respect from the man, he selected a south-facing second-floor bedroom of the house and lay down with the expectation of sleeping calmly through the night. He began to drift off sometime around midnight. Just as JPL was losing his consciousness, the door to the room that he'd chosen to sleep in swung open, as if it had been kicked with great force, even though he was sure that he'd locked it before laying down. Possibly figuring that his friend was playing a practical joke in an attempt to sway the odds of the bet, JPL immediately got up and searched the entire house. There was no sign that anyone except himself had been anywhere near the place. Not knowing whether to feel comforted, or frightened by such a realization, the man went back to bed. He'd no sooner put his head down again when he heard the sound of someone nearby splitting logs with an axe. JPL was really startled, because he had indeed noted a pile of logs near the house. As best he could remember, none had been split, but when he went outside to investigate the annoying sounds, he noticed that there was an axe propped up against the wall of the house, and that some of the wood had now been cut. Again he suspected that his friend was behind the prank, and so JPL took the axe, locked it in the house with him, and went back to bed. Seconds later, the sounds of wood cutting started up again. Determined to ignore the increasingly frightening sounds and the growing belief that the house was, as his friend had indicated, haunted, he laid in bed and listened to the axe crack against the logs. Finally, no longer able to contain himself, he ran down the stairs and out the front door. There, as neat as could be, was a stack of split wood. JPL must have been a pragmatic man, for upon seeing the sight he decided that the noises would now have stopped, for there were no more uncut logs. Once again he made his way back to bed. This time he heard, not axes splitting logs, but chainsaws cutting down more trees. A little later, the distinctive sounds of the axe began to echo in harmony with the saws. The spirits in this abandoned mountainside house were really beginning to get wound up now. His bed began to shake violently, and coming from underneath it, JPL heard what he was sure was a vicious catfight. Seconds later, he heard someone knocking on his bedroom door. Relieved at the thought of some human company, the terrified man raced to the door, but was unable to open it. He pulled and pulled with all his might, until whatever had been holding the door fast suddenly released its grasp, sending JPL flying across the room. However, the worst was yet to come as JPL landed in a frightened and sore heap. He was sure that he heard an evil-sounding laugh. In a last-ditch attempt to settle himself, JPL headed downstairs to have a cigarette. Just as he went to sit down, the chair that had been intending to sit on was yanked out from underneath him, and he landed on the floor for the second time in just a few minutes. He caught sight of his package of cigarettes laying nearby. For no apparent reason, they were soaking wet, and the sandwiches that he'd brought with him had been pulverized. Angry now and determined to catch the perpetrators, JPL rushed outside. He discovered nothing but beautiful mountain scenery, heralding the beginning of another day. JPL had at least lasted through the night in the house, and had therefore won the dare. He was more than ready to leave, and leave he did. But not before he noted that the woodpile outside the house was no longer split wood. It was inexplicably back the way it had been when he arrived the night before. Perhaps even now, the phantom sawing and cutting or a nightly occurrence of that old haunted house in the mountains. The story takes place in Victoria, BC. Historically haunted in Victoria. The properties along Dallas Road in Victoria, with their unobstructed view of Jean de Frucastrat in the foreground and the mountains of Washington State in the background, have long been acknowledged as among the most desirable pieces of real estate in Canada. If the scenery from these vantage points is a treat to behold today, we can only imagine how exquisite that same panorama must have been more than 100 years ago. The presence of such extraordinary natural beauty makes the long ago events surrounding publisher George Neas even more poignant. Very soon after he built a large home at a certain Dallas Road address, the province's gold boom of the mid-1800s turned to bust, and he lost the government contract to publish the Provincial Gazette, thrusting Neas into poverty. He abandoned his residence, some say without ever living in it, and fled to start life anew in Australia. The property, which stood on what used to be the Hudson Bay Company's Beckley Farm, sat empty for some time. If there were any children in the neighborhood, they might well have invented stories about the old Neas place being haunted, because after not too many months, it certainly looked the part. The old ground structure quickly deteriorated and acquired a shabby, foreboding appearance. However, it was another 2 years before the house actually became haunted. It was not only haunted, but apparently cursed as well. This part of the story began early in 1872 when the steamer Prince Albert sailed in Victoria's harbor from San Francisco, carrying immigrants to the island community. Victorians turned out in great numbers to welcome the ship and her passengers. Many of those standing on the dock that day had relatives on board whom they looked forward to helping settle in the growing community. As the tiny dark speck on the horizon became the discernible shape of a ship about to put into port, something of a party atmosphere pervaded those waiting. Sadly, the feelings of jubilation were soon dashed. The Prince Albert was making her way into the harbor with a yellow flag flying from her halyard. Everyone who saw the marker instantly understood its implications. Souls stricken with smallpox were on board. The ship docked only long enough for the Victoria-bound passengers to disembark and to disgorge all the sick and dying. It didn't matter whether these latter pathetic folks had intended to go further up island or not. The rule was that if a passenger was ill, he or she was escorted off the ship at the next port of call. Though that precaution eliminated most of the anxiety for the Prince Albert's crew, it certainly created an entirely new set of problems for the authorities in Victoria. Whatever were they to do with these patients? Eventually, some suggested that they might be safely quarantined in the abandoned house on the Beckley farm. And so they were. As the ship's captain had done, city officials in charge of such matters flew a yellow flag from the seconded building. The banner would serve as a warning to all, to use the euphemism of the day. This was a pest house. The cold, hard truth was that entering the house would bring a visitor into certain contact with the killer disease that was then ravaging much of the world's population. Initially, there were 7 patients isolated in Nia's former home, but an 8th victim disembarked from Prince Albert on the ship's return trip from Nanaimo. This one was a member of the ship's crew. Soon, the head count at the large home was back down to 7. However, when on June 23, 1872, a youngster named Bertha Whitney succumbed to the disease, her body was interred to an unmarked grave at Beckley Farm. Young Bertha's spirit was likely the first to haunt the property. The sailor from the afflicted ship was the next to die. His remains were also hastily concealed on the grounds. The other 6 patients remained in the home until they were well again. Such statistics reflected a most unusual and impressive rate of recovery for a group attacked by this oft-lethal plague. Members of the surrounding community, however, focused on the original owner's flight from the area, followed by the 2 deaths, and determined that the place was somehow inherently evil. The building's reputation as an evil place spread quickly. Once the 6 survivors recovered sufficiently to return to society, the makeshift pest house was abandoned for the second time in its short existence. Victorians, however, continued to give the empty place a wide berth, especially after dark. The few brave souls who did travel past the house on Dallas Road at night were often witnesses to some frightening and probably paranormal sights. From the available descriptions, it would seem that the windows in the house were frequently alive with supernatural phenomena, ignes fatae, or ghost lights, as the mysterious orbs of illumination are now known. Not surprisingly, the house of Beckley Farm remained unoccupied by the living. Anyway, no one from the area was interested in tempting fate by moving into the inevitably haunted house. About this time, however, an investor who claimed to be from San Francisco arrived in Victoria, calling himself Mr. P. Lackey. The nattily dressed man checked into the Angel Hotel. Over the next few weeks, the newcomer said little about himself. until suddenly announcing to the hotel staff that his wife would soon be joining him from England, and that he would therefore soon require more permanent accommodation. For reasons that are now unclear, the people at the hotel recommended that he consider residing at the former pest house. Their direction proved fateful. Lackey soon fell victim to the Beckley Farm jinx. The second last time that the man was seen alive, he was observed in a heated argument near the possessed house. His opponent was a woman who the witness had never seen before. The disagreement escalated until Lackey was observed recoiling from a vicious slap to the side of the head. When he was seen at the hotel later that day, the last time that anyone saw him alive, the man sported a badly bruised face. Determining the order of the events that followed the appearance was initially somewhat confusing. On February 17, 1873, someone decided to explore the Beckley Farm property, but both the person's name and motivations for doing so have long been lost to history. These explorations no doubt ended the moment that they revealed the corpse of a shabbily dressed man. Police immediately assessed that it was a murder, as the man had been shot through the head at close range and no weapon could be found. The confusion mounted with Angel Hotel staff's discovery of a suicide note in one of their rooms. Although it no longer much mattered, the man whom they knew as P. Lackey from San Francisco was actually P. Stalker from Scotland. What did matter now was that he was dead. The note indicated that he intended to shoot himself in the head. Further bewilderment erupted when a woman from Nanaimo was reported missing. Stranger still, her description exactly matched that of a woman seen slapping Lackey's, Stalker's, face from Victoria, North Island's residents were stricken with fear. They were sure that there was a murderer loose. It was several days before a series of events began to provide clues to all the mysteries, when a local street urchin tried to sell a gun to a shopkeeper. The man became suspicious and called the police. A quick check determined that the gun was identical to the one that killed the man found on Beckley Farm property. The youngster and his relatives were immediately apprehended, realizing that they were about to be accused of a crime much more heinous than the one that they'd actually committed. The little group hastily confessed their wrongdoings. They had found the well-dressed suicide victim with his gun laying beside him. Determining that the corpse had no use for either his fine clothes or his gun, they relieved him of all of it. Then, perhaps out of respect for the dead man's dignity, they dressed him in their old clothes and left him that way for the next person along to find. The house at Beckley Farm was living up to its malevolent reputation. It would not last much longer, however. The haunted, possessed, jinxed, and cursed house shortly afterward transformed itself into a pile of ashes in a mysterious and sudden blaze. Many people were sure that the ghost lights had started the fire. Nobody mourned the loss of the haunted house on Dallas Road. Unbelievably, the evil forces were not yet completely spent. One of the Prince Albert stricken passengers who'd been isolated at the Beckley Farm house had recovered fully and was moving on with her life. Toward that end, she sent the dress that she'd worn on the voyage to a seamstress shop to be altered slightly. According to a May 2nd, 1953 newspaper report, the dressmaker and several members of her family contracted smallpox from the soiled and infected dress. Their deaths were the final ones recorded as having been associated with the haunted house on Dallas Road. This story takes place in West End, Vancouver. Bedtime Party. An excellent example of a retrocognition took place during the early 1930s, at a party in a recently renovated West End Vancouver house, where the event was witnessed by a room full of people. To learn the background of this intriguing story, we must go back to the early 1900s, when a man and his wife purchased a small parcel of land in what is now the West End and proceeded to build their home on it. They moved in as soon as the house was completed. Neighbors later reported that the newcomers were rather an odd pair, and that the woman was extremely outgoing, but the man was a virtual recluse. No one in the area had a chance to learn much more than that about the home owners, because the woman died just 6 months later. The bereaved husband hastily sold the place and moved away. No more is known about the place between that time and 1931, when it was purchased by a young couple. Initially, the two were delighted with their real estate investment exactly as it was, and they did not plan to make any changes to the interior layout. The master bedroom was on the main floor, which they felt was a convenient arrangement. From their first night in that room, however, they felt uneasy. When the feeling did not leave, the pair decided that some renovations would be necessary after all. They decided to sleep in another bedroom and to enlarge the living room to include most of what had been the original master bedroom. It was not long before the changes had been completed. The couple was so pleased with the way that their home looked now that they decided to invite their friends over for a party. The celebration got off to a successful start, according to a woman who had been a guest that night. Everyone was enjoying themselves in the newly enlarged living room until precisely 11 o'clock. She recalled the room becoming unaccountably cold at that moment and described a whirlwind of nothingness suddenly manifesting in the part of the room that had been the bedroom. Then out of the whirlwind slowly emerged a massive 4-poster bed of richest rosewood, upon which a woman was laying clearly at the point of departure from this life. Her eyes were fixed in fear and horror upon the indistinct figure of a man sitting in a Victorian chair at her bedside. One of the guests, a neighbor who had lived in the area a long time, shouted out that he recognized the apparitions. He identified them as the couple who had built the place, the home's original owners. The images didn't stay long, but they did succeed in bringing the housewarming party to an abrupt and early end. Agreeing to tell no one of the paranormal event that they had just witnessed in their friend's home, the guests quickly dispersed. Despite all the effort that they had put into the place, the new owners now realized that they could never be comfortable staying there, and immediately listed their home for sale. The couple was relieved that the place sold quickly, as they wanted to be completely clear of anything associated with the haunted house. They even arranged to sell all the newly purchased furniture, draperies, and rugs. The woman who provided the account of the party and the manifestation of the bed and the apparitions attended the auction where her friend's belongings were to be sold. Perhaps she was interested in purchasing some of the items herself, for she inspected the articles carefully. The living room rug was especially attractive to her. Her interest quickly turned to horror, however, when she discovered at the end of the carpet there was a rectangular arrangement of 4 well-worn indentations. It looked exactly as though some heavy piece of furniture, perhaps a large 4-poster rosewood bed, had rested there for a matter of months. Most of the people who attended that housewarming party had presumably by now gone on to their final reward, without ever having publicly identified themselves as participants in this incident of retrocognition. And the haunted house, as is usually inevitable in the case of such valuable real estate, the house was demolished and a large apartment building now stands where it once did. It would be interesting to know if any of the tenants have ever seen anything unexplainable anywhere in any of the suites.